The shack had been standing crooked on the north end of the Harlan County auction lot since before anyone in Coldwater Springs could remember, and in the autumn of 1887, the county assessor's office decided to be rid of it. The structure was not worth describing at length, but the assessor's office had made the attempt anyway, and the attempt ran to 2 sentences. 2 walls had separated at a corner joint, the roof had buckled inward over the eastern half, and the floor planking had rotted through in 3 places, leaving gaps wide enough to lose a boot. No one had occupied it in at least 12 years. The assessor's ledger listed it simply as a derelict outbuilding and assessed its value at nothing the county wished to collect. The lot it sat on was clay hardpan, mostly worthless for farming, the soil thin and alkaline, the kind of ground that grew scrub grass and nothing else, without a great deal of amendment and argument. The nearest water was a quarter-mile downhill. When the auctioneer held it up as a lot, he did so with the expression of a man offering to give away something heavy, and the crowd took the cue and stood with their arms folded. $3 was the only bid. The woman who made it was 27 years old, standing near the back of the crowd with a canvas satchel at her hip and her hands quiet at her sides. She wore a cream-colored pioneer dress with a small floral print at the hem, and she had a vivid red shawl across her shoulders that had seen hard travel and still kept its color. A few of the men nearby exchanged glances. Someone near the fence laughed, not loudly, just the kind of laugh a person makes when they have decided someone else is simple. The auctioneer stamped his book and moved on to the next lot without ceremony, and the woman walked to the clerk's table, counted out $3 silver from a coin purse she kept in the satchel, and received a receipt that the clerk had already begun folding in half before he finished writing her name on it. Her name was Cora Selby. She had come to Harlan County 6 weeks earlier with $41, a pair of well-maintained woodworking chisels wrapped in oilcloth, and the particular knowledge her father had spent 30 years acquiring before a heart seizure took him in the spring. He had been a joiner. Not a carpenter in the general sense, not a man who framed walls or laid floors, but a joiner of the older type, a craftsman who understood how wood was fastened before nails became cheap, how a door was hung and secured, how a mortise interlocked with a tenon under the weight of decades. He had taught her to read a joint the way a doctor reads a pulse. He had taught her what the grain of a board records about its life. He had taught her specifically about chains, about the difference between a chain installed carelessly and a chain installed with the intention that it would hold across years rather than afternoons. That was the thing no one in the crowd had noticed, and no one would have known to notice, because to the casual eye it looked like nothing at all. The barn door of the shack, set into what had been the north wall before that wall developed its lean, was secured with a wrought iron chain of the kind used to tether draft animals. The chain was old. The rust on it was the deep orange-brown of old blood, layered and pitted in a way that spoke of many seasons rather than one, and it had been looped through a staple driven into the doorframe and then through a hasp fixed to the door itself, and the ends were joined by a padlock that had been painted over at some point, probably to disguise it as something simpler than it was. Cora had noticed it from 40 feet away when she first walked the lot before the auction began. She had gone close, crouched, and looked at it for a long time without touching it. She had looked at where the chain was seated, at the gauge of the links, at the way the padlock body was shaped beneath its coat of brown paint, at the particular manner in which the chain had been drawn taut against the frame rather than left to hang loose. Then she had stood and walked back to the edge of the lot and decided that $3 was exactly the right price to pay. No one had chained that barn door as a matter of habit. If the question of who had done it and why had interested the men at that auction, one of them would have solved it long before Cora Selby arrived in Harlan County. The answer was built into the metal, visible to anyone who understood what to look for. She had been taught to look. Her father had spent years working on farm structures across 3 counties in Ohio before moving west, and he had explained to her more than once how a working man secured something valuable when he had no safe and no vault, and no one he could trust with a key. He had explained what it looked like when a chain was installed to be permanent rather than temporary. A temporary chain is looped loosely, and the lock hangs free. A permanent chain is seated against the wood, drawn taut, and fixed so that it does not rattle and does not invite examination by appearing to be anything other than a door that happens to be closed. It is installed by someone who is not planning to open it again soon. It is installed by someone who wants the door to look closed and empty, rather than secured, and who paints the lock to assist that impression. Her father had shown her a chain like that once, on a cooperage outside Cincinnati, and told her to think about who would have put it there, and why. She had stood looking at it for a long time. He had not told her the answer. That was how he taught. Cora walked back to the clerk's table that afternoon. She had a question about the shack's ownership history, and she asked it plainly, stating that she wanted to know who had last occupied the property and how the county had come to hold it. The clerk looked at her with moderate indifference and told her she could consult the recorder's office in the morning if she wanted the chain of title, that it was across the street and opened at 8, and that the county had held the property for taxes unpaid by a man named Alton Birch, who had died 6 years prior, leaving no recorded heirs and no estate worth probating. Cora thanked him and folded her receipt into her satchel alongside the chisels. She found lodging for the night at a boarding house near the feed store, a 2-story frame building run by a widow named Mrs. Holt, who asked no questions and kept a clean table. Cora ate supper, went to her room, and sat on the edge of the cot in the fading light, turning the receipt over in her hands and thinking about chains. In the morning, she went to the recorder's office. The parcel had a longer history than its current condition suggested. The recorder's ledgers were arranged by year, and the clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a methodical manner, pulled the relevant volumes without complaint and set them on the reading table without being asked twice. The property had originally been platted in 1861 as part of a homestead claim filed by a man named Josiah Tremaine, who had worked the land for 11 years, filed his final proof, paid his fees to the land office, and in 1872 sold the eastern 40 acres, including the shack and its outbuildings, to a man named Alton Birch for a stated consideration of $220. That sale appeared in the record in the clean, formal hand of whatever clerk had recorded it that year. What appeared less cleanly was a note in the margin of a subsequent ledger entry from 1873, written in a different hand and squeezed between lines as if added after the fact, that indicated a dispute over the boundary line between the remaining Tremaine parcel and the Birch purchase, settled in favor of Birch by a county arbitration board whose members were not named in the margin note. Cora read the margin note twice. She wrote down the names and dates on a small paper, the kind she carried folded in her breast pocket. Then she asked the clerk whether she might see the original arbitration record for 1873. The clerk went to the archive room. He was gone for some time. When he returned, he had the careful expression of a person delivering news they would rather not deliver. The arbitration file for that year appeared to be missing from its proper sequence, he said. He had checked the adjacent years. The index listed it. The folder itself was not present. He was sorry. Cora thanked him for looking and left. She stood on the board sidewalk outside the recorder's office for a moment in the mild autumn light, watching a wagon negotiate the main street's ruts. A missing file was not the same as a destroyed file. A missing file was a file that someone had moved or had removed or had not bothered to return to its place after the last time it was consulted. Any of those possibilities was informative. If you have ever watched someone dismiss a thread and then pick it up again 10 yards farther down the road, you will recognize what she did next. She did not argue with the missing folder. She walked back to the shack, set her canvas satchel on the ground, and went to work. The first thing she did was examine the doorframe around the chain. She ran her fingers along the wood before she looked at it, because her father had taught her that hands often understood what eyes missed, that the grain beneath a fingertip tells a different story than the grain at arm's length. The frame had been repaired at some point, specifically the section where the staple was driven, and the repair was done with a different wood than the original, a harder grain, dense and close-ringed, heartwood of a kind her father had called trustworthy. That word, trustworthy, was his specific term for a wood chosen not for convenience, but for intention. You did not use heartwood on a quick repair. You did not seek it out and shape it to fit unless you expected the repair to bear weight for a long time. Someone had replaced that section of frame specifically to seat the chain securely, to give the staple something it could not easily pull free from. The work was old, probably 1872 or 1873, based on the weathering differential between the repair wood and the surrounding structure. The repair slightly less gray, the grain slightly less open to the touch. The second thing she did was look at the padlock more carefully. She had brought a wire brush in her satchel, the kind used to clean rust from iron tools, and she used it lightly on the lock body to disturb the paint without damaging the metal beneath. The work took patience. The paint was old and had bonded well, and she had to work around the lock's edges along the seams, coaxing the outer coat loose in small sections. What emerged slowly was the shape of a mortise lock body, a specific profile she had been made to learn. The type was made by a manufacturer based in Cincinnati, Ohio, whose annual catalog her father had kept on the shelf above his workbench, and whose lock profiles he had made her identify by profile and by touch before she was 12 years old. He had a collection of old lock bodies, 14 in all, and he had made her name each one without the catalog before he would let her use his tools. This particular model, the Mortise pattern with the flat-headed bolt and the distinctive rounded shackle clearance, had been discontinued in 1869. The company had moved to a more economical design after that, using a different casting method. This older model had not been sold new in any hardware store in Kansas Territory after that year. Someone had installed this lock on this chain with this doorframe repair sometime between 1869 and 1873, and had done so with specific care. That care was what mattered. A person secures a door carelessly when they are in a hurry and do not expect anyone to notice. A person secures a door this carefully when they have placed something inside worth protecting, and when they believe that the security will go unexamined long enough to serve their purpose. They choose a good lock from their existing stock, a trustworthy wood for the frame repair, and they paint the lock body so that a passing eye sees closed rather than sealed. Her purpose was not to force the lock. She was not in a hurry. She sat on a flat stone near the wall and considered what she knew about the sequence of events. In 1872, Josiah Tremaine sold the eastern 40 acres to Alton Birch. In 1873, a boundary dispute was arbitrated in Birch's favor, and the file for that arbitration was missing from the county record. The shack had belonged to Birch until his death 6 years ago, and yet the chain on this door was older than the sale, installed with a lock already discontinued in 1869, using a frame repair that showed greater weathering than the surrounding wood would have shown if the repair were newer, which meant Josiah Tremaine had chained this door himself. She thought about that for a moment. Tremaine had owned the shack until 1872. He had installed the chain before the sale, He had used a lock from his own stock, an older model, not one he had gone to buy recently. He had repaired the frame with trustworthy wood, seated the chain taut, and painted the lock. He had done this before he sold the Eastern 40 or at the moment of the sale, or possibly in anticipation of a transaction he was being pressured toward. There was a woman named Edna Tremaine, listed on the original homestead patent as Josiah's wife, which Cora had noted from the 1861 entry in the recorder's ledger. She had not noted a death record for Edna Tremaine in the county's register. She had not noted a removal from Harlan County. Those were two different things, and the difference between them was worth establishing. She went to find someone who had been in Coldwater Springs long enough to remember the Tremaines. She found him on the second inquiry, through a woman at the dry goods counter who pointed her toward the south end of town with the comment that Gil Pratt had been here longer than the main street and knew more than he generally said. Gil Pratt ran the blacksmith shop from a low stone building with a wide front door and a banked fire that kept the space warm, even with the doors open. And he was 63 years old and had the manner of a person who had learned that most questions are asked for insufficient reasons and that the best answer to an insufficient question is silence. He looked at Cora with the measuring look of a man deciding whether to spend words, and she waited without filling the silence and without shifting her weight or adjusting her shawl. And the patience of her posture seemed to decide him in a way that explanation would not have. He told her that Josiah Tremaine had been a decent man, careful with his land and careful with his word, and a poor judge of buyers. He told her that Alton Birch had arrived in Harlan County in 1871 with credentials from a land office in Missouri that Gil had never seen verified, and that Birch had been active in the county assessor's office as a volunteer clerk without pay for 2 years before the Tremaine sale, which meant he had access to survey records, plat maps, and tax assessment documents that most private citizens did not. It was not unusual for a civic-minded man to volunteer at the assessor's office. It was not unusual unless, afterward, the same man purchased a parcel from a homesteader whose land records he had been handling. He told her that Josiah Tremaine had died in 1875, 3 years after the sale, not in any dramatic way, just worn out. The way a man gets worn out when the thing he worked a decade to build slips through a transaction he did not fully understand. His wife, Edna, had left the county shortly after. He did not know where she had gone. He told her that the arbitration of 1873 had moved a boundary stake 40 feet in Birch's favor, which confirmed Birch's claim to a strip of the original Tremaine parcel that had not been included in the sale price, and that Tremaine had intended to keep. The strip was not prime ground, but it contained access to a seasonal creek, which made it more valuable than its acreage suggested. He had been of the opinion at the time that something was off about the composition of the arbitration board. He had not been asked his opinion, which was itself informative. Cora thanked him. She went back to the shack. What she had, assembled carefully, was a shape. It was not complete, but a shape was enough to work from. Birch had positioned himself in the assessor's office, acquired access to survey records, orchestrated a sale, and then an arbitration that expanded his holding beyond what he had paid for. The missing arbitration file was consistent with a document that would not survive comfortable examination. The chain on the barn door was consistent with a man who had, before any of that happened, placed something inside the shack that he did not want discovered, not destroyed, protected, left in a condition where it could be retrieved or further used if needed, and forgotten if it was not. The lock was the answer to the question of who had installed the chain, not where it was or how heavy it was, but what its date of manufacture said about when it was put in place and by whose hand. She needed to open it. Her father had taught her about a type of key-cutting method he called impression work, using a soft metal blank that, when pressed into a lock under light, steady turning torque, took the impression of the internal wards, the ridges and valleys that guided the correct key's cuts. He had 2 blank sets in his kit, one for common profiles and one for the older mortise style. Cora had both in her satchel, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the chisels. The process required patience above everything else. The lock had sat for at least 14 years in a sealed space, and the keyway, the narrow slot that admitted the key's blade, was partly seized with a fine mineral crust that had built up from moisture trapped in the painted metal. She needed to clear it before the blank would seat cleanly. She used a narrow probe she had fashioned from a stiff wire, working it along the keyway's channel without forcing it, loosening the deposit in small sections. Then she applied a small amount of rendered fat from a tin she kept for tool maintenance, a practice her father had used on every lock he worked, and let it sit for a time before she returned to the probe. The lock was not resistant so much as it was stiff with time, and stiffness, unlike resistance, yields to patience. The difference between forcing a thing and waiting for it to yield was a lesson he had given her 3 times before she understood it fully. On the 3rd attempt with the impression blank, the blank seated cleanly inside the keyway, and when she applied light turning torque and withdrew it, the soft metal carried an impression of the wards clearly enough to read. She sat cross-legged on the hard ground in front of the door, with the blank rested on her knee, and worked it with the small flat file from her kit, cutting down the blank's profile to match the impression. She used the rounded tip of the narrow chisel for the finer work, the places where the file was too coarse to be precise. The afternoon light shifted as she worked, moving from high and flat to low and golden, laying long shadows across the hardpan. The key she had when she finished was not beautiful. It was functional, which was what was needed. It turned in the lock on the 2nd try. The hasp swung free. The chain, when she lifted it away from the staple, was heavier than it looked, and the rust on the links flaked onto her palms and left orange stains across her fingers. She lowered it to the ground carefully, setting it down rather than dropping it because it had done its job and deserved that. The door resisted. The frame had settled in the years of the shack's decline, and the bottom edge of the door had warped slightly, dragging across the floor planking. She lifted as she pulled, taking the door's weight on the hinge side, and it opened with a long, low groan, the sound of wood moving that had not moved in a very long time. The air that came out of the interior was cold and still, the particular cold of a sealed space, the cold of things held exactly as they had been left. She stood in the opening and waited for her eyes to adjust. The interior was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, and nearly empty. The floor was plank, denser and more sound than the rest of the structure, because it had been protected from the weather, and the walls were bare, except for a single wooden shelf built into the north face, set at about hip height, long enough to hold several objects side by side. A single small window on the east wall had been shuttered from inside with a wooden panel that was nailed in place, admitting no light. 2 empty shelves on the east wall held nothing but dust. The low shelf on the north face held something. There were 3 items on it: a tin cash box of moderate size, latched but not locked; a rolled paper tied with a strip of leather that had dried and contracted around the roll over the years; and a bound ledger, small, narrower than a standard account book, the kind a careful person keeps for private record-keeping, that they do not wish to be mistaken for an official document. Cora set her satchel on the floor beside the door. She breathed in the sealed air of the room, which smelled of old wood and mineral dust and nothing else. Then she took a breath and went to the shelf. She opened the tin box first. It held no money. It held 11 folded papers, each one a document of some kind. the paper yellowed and brittle at the edges but structurally intact, preserved by the sealed air and the darkness. She unfolded the first one with care, working the fold lines gently before opening the sheet, the way her father had taught her to handle old paper. It was a survey plat, dated 1869, signed by a licensed surveyor from Kansas City, whose name she recognized from the margin of one of the recorder's ledger entries. The plat showed the Tremaine homestead boundary in precise terms, with the eastern edge marked at a set of named reference stakes and their compass bearings from the nearest section corner. She unfolded the second paper. It was a handwritten copy of a deed, its language matching the legal standard for Kansas Territory in the 1860s, listing the parcel boundaries in terms entirely consistent with the 1869 plat. The third paper was a letter, also dated 1869, addressed to Josiah Tremaine from the same surveyor, confirming the stake positions, listing the distances measured, and noting in the final paragraph that a copy of the survey had been filed with the county land office in Lawrence as required by law. She counted the remaining papers without unfolding all of them, turning them by their edges, reading the dates and the headings that were visible without fully opening each sheet. 7 more documents, each one representing some aspect of the original survey or the original title. A set of records kept in duplicate by a man who had understood, even in 1869, that his boundary might one day require proof beyond what the county recorder's office was willing to preserve. The rolled paper, when she freed it from the dried leather strap, was a hand-drawn duplicate of the 1869 plat, drawn by Josiah Tremaine himself in a steady, measured hand. He had noted his measurements in feet and chains, and at the bottom of the sheet he had written in careful letters that the distances had been paced and verified against the surveyor's stakes on 3 separate occasions, in 3 separate seasons, and that they had not varied. The ledger was the most important thing she had found since she opened the door. It was Josiah Tremaine's private account book, kept from 1870 to 1872, and it recorded in the plain, unhurried hand of a man who was keeping a record for himself rather than for presentation, a series of conversations and payments that had not appeared in any county document. On the second page, he had written a summary of a conversation with Alton Birch in the autumn of 1871, in which Birch had offered to expedite the final confirmation of the homestead patent, which had been delayed by a clerical complication at the land office in Lawrence, something about a discrepancy in the survey reference numbers. Birch had framed his offer as a favor, the kind a man with useful connections offered to a neighbor. In exchange, he had asked for a first right of purchase on the eastern 40 acres if Tremaine ever decided to sell. Tremaine had written the word "facilitate" in his account of the conversation, and then underlined it, and in the margin beside the underline he had written the single word "explained," which Cora understood to be his notation for something he had later come to see clearly for what it was. In a subsequent entry, dated several weeks later, Tremaine had recorded that the clerical complication at the land office had been resolved. The patent confirmation had proceeded. He did not say how the resolution had been arranged, but the implication in the spacing of the entries, in the brief flatness of that notation between 2 longer paragraphs of farm accounting, suggested that by the time he wrote it he already suspected something about the resolution that he did not want to write plainly. Birch had been the clerk responsible for the clerical complication. Tremaine had eventually understood that. He had written it plainly on the ledger's last page, in larger letters than the rest of his entries, as if the size of the writing corresponded to the size of what he had come to understand. He had written the date, the spring of 1872, and the statement that he had secured his duplicate records and his private account in the north outbuilding, where they would remain until they were needed, and that he had used a good lock and good wood, and had painted the lock so that it did not read as a sealed place to anyone who did not know what a sealed place looked like. He had trusted, apparently, that someone would eventually know. Cora carried the tin box, the rolled plat, and the ledger to the boarding house that evening in her canvas satchel, walking the main street of Coldwater Springs in the low orange light of late afternoon. She ate supper at Mrs. Holt's table, and then went to her room and sat at the small writing table in the corner for several hours, going through each paper in order. She made a list of what she had, annotated with the date of each document, the name of the person who had created it, and what it established. She was not angry, not. She was resolved in the way her father had been resolved when he found a joint that had been cut badly on purpose rather than by error, a particular quality of stillness that settled over his hands and face and made his movements more economical, not less. There was no shouting in that resolution. There was only the knowledge of what needed to be done and the patience to do it in the right order. In the morning, she went back to Gil Pratt. She asked him whether he knew where Edna Tremaine had settled after leaving the county. He studied her face for a moment the way he had before, that measuring assessment, and then he told her that he had heard, some years back, that Edna had gone to her sister's family in Wichita. He did not have an address, but the sister's name was Ruth, and the family's name before she married had been Calder, which was not a common name in Kansas and might be traceable through the Wichita post office. He told her that Edna had a son, born in 1870, who would be about 17 years old now, and that the son's name was William, and that Josiah had named him after his own father. He delivered all of this slowly, as if he were testing the weight of each piece before he let it go, as if he were deciding with each sentence whether the rest ought to follow. Cora thanked him and told him what she had found in the shack. She told him plainly, and without theater, the way she would have told her father, naming each document and what it established, listing the dates in sequence so the shape was clear. He set down the tongs he had been holding and did not pick them up again for the duration of the conversation. When she finished, he stood for a moment looking at the banked fire, and then he told her about Birch's estate, or the lack of one, and about the nephew in Missouri. The land office in Lawrence had a copy of the 1869 survey on file, which the surveyor's letter to Tremaine explicitly confirmed. That copy had been available for examination at any point in the 18 years since the survey was conducted. No one had examined it, because no one had known to ask, and no one had thought to ask, because no one had paid $3 for a shack with a particular chain on its barn door, and then sat in front of a rusted padlock thinking about why someone had gone to such lengths. She wrote to the county land office in Lawrence that afternoon, from Mrs. Holt's writing table, using the good paper she had brought in her satchel. She wrote to the Kansas Territorial Court's Records Division with a formal inquiry about the arbitration proceedings of 1873 and their surviving documentation. She wrote to the postmaster in Wichita, requesting that the letter be passed along to any resident of the name Edna Tremaine or Edna Calder Tremaine, or, failing that, to the family of a woman named Ruth Calder. She was careful in the letters. She stated precisely what she held, what she believed it established, and what she was asking each office to confirm or provide. She made no accusations beyond what the documents could support, because accusations unsupported by documents were noise, and noise drew attention to the accuser rather than the evidence. The process that followed took the better part of 2 months. The land office in Lawrence wrote back within 3 weeks, confirming that their copy of the 1869 Tremaine survey was on file in their archive and had never been transferred, removed, or superseded by any later survey. The Territorial Court's Records Division responded more slowly, but their letter was more substantial. The 1873 arbitration file had been misfiled in an adjacent sequence, placed between documents of a different year, in a manner that was either careless or intentional, and had the same practical effect in either case. The file, when examined, showed irregularities in the composition of the arbitration board. 2 of the 3 members had conducted financial business with Alton Birch in the years preceding the arbitration, dealings that had not been disclosed to the parties and that would, under the territorial court's standing rules for arbitration, have required those members to recuse themselves. The court opened a formal review. A property law attorney in Lawrence, whose name appeared in several of the recorder's filings Cora had read, wrote to her requesting permission to cite her documents in the review proceedings. She granted it. Edna Tremaine wrote back from Wichita. Her letter was short, written in a careful hand that showed the kind of economy that comes from writing only when something needs to be said. She wrote that she had believed her husband's records existed, but had never known where he had kept them, and that she had looked for them in the years after his death without finding them, and that the looking had eventually stopped. She wrote that William was grown and working on a cattle ranch outside Wichita, and that she had told him all she knew of his father's land and of what had happened to it. She thanked Cora by name. And then, in the letter's last line, written in slightly smaller letters as if she had not quite decided whether to include it, she wrote that she had stopped praying for justice a good many years ago and had not expected it to arrive in the form of a woman she had never met. The territorial court's review concluded in the spring of 1888. The boundary adjustment of 1873 was invalidated on the grounds of the undisclosed conflicts of interest on the arbitration board. The eastern 40 acres, including the strip along the Seasonal Creek, reverted in title to the Tremaine estate. Because Josiah Tremaine had died without a recorded will, but with a surviving spouse and a surviving son, the heirs were established as Edna and William Tremaine. The nephew in Missouri was formally notified through his attorney of record. He did not contest the ruling. The land had not been developed in his time holding it, had not earned him anything, and the cost of a legal contest, his attorney apparently advised him, would exceed any value he might recover. William Tremaine came to Harlan County in June of 1888 to file the deed transfer at the recorder's office. He was 18 years old, broad across the shoulders, and carried himself with the settled manner of a young man who had been working hard for several years. Gil Pratt said he had his father's steadiness. William stopped at the blacksmith shop the afternoon he arrived, because Gil Pratt had been one of the men Cora had corresponded with through the review process, and William wanted to meet him. They talked for an hour. Pratt could not have told you afterward exactly what was said, but he remembered that the young man had not asked what justice felt like, or whether he should be grateful, or any of the questions a person asks when something arrives late. He had asked practical questions. What condition was the soil in? What had the Seasonal Creek done over the past 15 years? Whether the acreage could support a small herd to begin with and be expanded by degrees. He walked the eastern 40 acres before he went to the recorder's office, before he ate, before he did anything else. Cora was not present for that. She had gone by then. She had stayed through the early weeks of the court review, long enough to give her formal statement to the court's examiner, a careful man from Lawrence who had read all her documents twice before he asked his first question. She had handed over the tin box with the 11 papers, the rolled plat, and the ledger to the court's custody, properly inventoried on a receipt that the examiner signed and returned to her. The examination was thorough and took most of a morning. At the end of it, the examiner had told her in the dry manner of an officer of the court, who was not in the habit of offering personal opinion, that the documentation was exceptionally well organized, and that the analysis connecting the lock's manufacture date to the chain's installation was the kind of reasoning he did not often encounter in land dispute matters. She had thanked him and left. She received a formal acknowledgement letter from the court, a single signed page on the court's paper, which she folded and kept in her satchel alongside her father's chisels. Then she had settled her account at the boarding house, bought a sound horse from the livery at a price that left her still ahead of where she had started, and ridden north. The shack itself was not recoverable. The county assessor, in closing out the property, assessed the structure as a liability on the grounds that its condition made it a hazard and that the cost of repair would exceed any value it could return. It was demolished in the autumn of 1888 by two men with a team and a stout chain. The kind of chain used for pulling stumps, not the kind Josiah Tremaine had chosen for the barn door. The site was cleared. The low shelf on the north face, which had held his documents for 16 years in the cold and the dark, was broken up for firewood along with the rest. Gil Pratt kept the chain. He unlooped it from the fallen doorframe before the demolition crew hauled the material away, and he carried it back to the blacksmith shop and hung it on a nail near his anvil. He could not have offered a precise account of why he did this. He was not a sentimental man, and the chain had no ornamental quality, being nothing but wrought iron corroded down to a dull brown, the links barely able to turn on each other anymore. The padlock hanging on it by its hasp with the paint mostly gone now, the metal beneath showing its age without apology. But someone had put it there with intention. Someone had chosen the gauge of the links with care, had chosen a lock from his own stock that was made well enough to hold across a span of years, had repaired the doorframe with trustworthy wood so the staple would not pull, and had then stepped back and left the whole arrangement to work across however many years it took. He had trusted that the right person would come along eventually, a person who had been taught to read a chain the way a chain deserves to be read, and that when she came, she would understand what she was looking at and would do something with the understanding. That was the kind of work a craftsman respected. It was the kind of work that argued for something without making a speech, that proved its case through the quality of its construction rather than through the loudness of its claim. Gil Pratt kept the chain because he believed in the argument it had made. He kept it because arguments made that carefully, with that quality of material and that patience of execution, deserve to be remembered by someone who can say, this was here, and it did what it was built to do. Some wrongs are answered through confrontation, and some through law, and some through the slow accumulation of evidence in a place where evidence can be preserved. Josiah Tremaine had understood the third way. He had understood it in 1869, when he took the lock from his stock and chose the frame wood, and drew taut the chain. And he had acted on that understanding without knowing how many years it would take, or whose hands would finally close around the key. He had trusted the chain, and the lock, and the sealed air of a small dark room, and he had been right to trust them. A boundary moved back to where it had always been is not a dramatic thing to witness from the outside. It does not announce itself. A deed transfers. A name is restored to a ledger. A family returns to a piece of ground that was always theirs. If you were passing through Harlan County in the summer of 1889, and you see a young man working the eastern 40 acres north of Coldwater Springs, you do not know unless someone tells you what it cost to get him there, or how long the getting took, or what a woman in a red shawl did with a set of chisels and an impression blank one autumn afternoon the year before. If this kind of story stays with you, the kind where the proof was waiting all along and the right pair of hands arrived eventually to find it, leave a word below. Stories like this one are worth telling. Edna Tremaine lived another 14 years after the deed transferred to her son. She died in Wichita in 1902 and was buried beside her sister Ruth in a churchyard on the east side of the city. William worked the eastern 40 acres beginning in 1889 and made a going concern of it by 1893. He was still there at the century's turn, and the land had not gone back to scrub. Cora kept her father's chisels. She kept them clean and sharp as he had shown her, because a tool maintained is a tool ready, and a tool ready is a promise kept to whoever taught you to use it. The chain hung on its nail in Gil Pratt's shop for the rest of his working years. When he died in 1901, his daughter inherited the shop and kept it running, and the chain hung where he had put it because no one thought to move it, and because objects that have earned their place tend to stay.